Spoken word poetry, an art that old Arabic writers used to challenge and determine each other's wit and intelligence, the type of poetry that is more hip than traditional poetry, and just as engaging as its cousin, rap. Spoken word poetry is an art form that, through verse and sound, nurses the personal into the profound, creates an art for exchange, and in doing so, spoken word poetry urges participation. So if you vibe with something you hear, feel free to grab your fingers and start snapping. If that is not enough for you, you can bring your hands together, start clapping. If you're like me and you like to practice your vocals, you can sound as if someone told you the pizza just came in and go, But if you're feeling a little bit more ambitious, you can use your lisan. What is lisan? Lisan, origin, Arabic. When translated into English, becomes the word tongue. Tongue, a noun, its first definition, the fleshy, muscular organ used for tasting, licking, swallowing, and in humans, articulating speech. Example, a narrative begins with the Republic of Tongue. It begins with the song of your public lung playing with poetry's superfly rap sheet. It begins with that foreign street talk your father taught. It begins with you telling your best friend, hey, the bumps in my mother's accent are as beautiful as an angel's wing in flight. It begins with you painting a canvas, using your 32 teeth alongside the ink of history born in your blood. Its second definition, used in reference to a person's style or manner of speaking. Example, like how I learned to speak my mother tongue through my mother's tongue, how despite every word she spoke became shackled and shredded by the pounds of a language she did not understand. The Egyptian tale she would tell me at my bedside when I was just a child, still growing up in Brooklyn, still learning the difference between sesame and says me, has watered the Arabic roots of my tongue with a taste finer than any field of sweet mangoes, sharper than a butcher preparing his blade. She has gifted me a tongue that is just as wise as a fool and just as wise as a prophet. Its third definition, the free swinging metal piece inside a bell, which is made to strike the bell to produce sound. Example, everyone raise your tongue to the roof of your mouth and then return it again to its seat. Can you feel that? The instrument cage between your teeth? Can you feel that Nile spit, H and speak hip hop beat in your mouth? Can you hear the tongue that rings alive the anatomy of all of your names, and the names of your fathers, and the names of your mothers, of your aunts and of your uncles and your brothers and sisters and the ancestors who are the roots of your family trees? Can you hear that tongue ringing alive and true? Its fourth definition, a long, low promontory of land. Example, yesterday, my father told me he didn't want to forget about home, so to comfort him, I held his palm. And that's when we both learned that the exchange of our hands had become a language our bodies spoke. Began to tell me of Egypt, the Sa'idi tongue my father would herd sheep on when he was a young farmer boy, that every morning by the call to prayer, an Egyptian sun would rise just between the cable lines with the waking sky, the dark color of cornflower, that on the ground was a parade of blue lotus petals, and hanging above him on every street corner, like fresh cuts of storefront lamb, were white jasmine dresses to be sold. And beyond was the selling of prayer rugs that told him, this is what you pray to. Its fifth definition, the vibrating reed of a musical instrument. Example, letting the chords in your throat become a tongue. Let it scrape together a song to become a gospel understood and sung in unison, to become a soprano bent into season, to become an oghniya that you can play on repeat. Call this an incendiary art, a celestial calling the opus of music, the art of one becoming a walking lyric that we can all jam to when one becomes a message that isn't left unread. I once buried these stories as if it were a sin, a coffin buried into the soil on my brown skin, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed that one day it will bloom, to rise and ride the wind across an ocean, across a border, across a country, to arrive to you. That poem that you all just heard, Lisan, was a poem that I wrote specifically for this talk as a way for me to introduce myself to all of you, but also to explore the meaning of someone's mother tongue and motherland, and the importance and impact of sharing that type of story with others. If I were to ask you all off of the top of your heads, if you were able to name an Arabic author, how many would be able to? Think about mainstream literature. How many of those stories are truly representative of global narrative? There are stories that go unrecognized, unsung, and buried every day. From my perspective, those buried stories happen to be Arabic tales. Growing up in the American public school system, most of the writers that I was exposed to were dated writers, such as William Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman. These writers who have been universally set as the pinnacle of literary accomplishment, which resulted in me limiting myself from exploring new writers beyond them. Till this point, even the consideration of an Arabic person creating literature was a thought that was so uncanny to me. But over time, I began to realize the influence of global rhyme and narrative within American poetry. Take this poem, for example. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. These woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This popular poem was written by Robert Frost, an icon of American letters. Yet what greatly surprised me about this poem was of its origin, and the fact that it did not originate from a traditional style of American poetry, but of an Arabic one, particularly the form of rubai, an Arabic poetic verse. When I first learned this, I started to wonder why we weren't reading the works of the Arabic poets who have pioneered this type of poetry. Why in the classrooms we weren't reading literature beyond just American and European writings. And so, why are those other stories important? Why is it important for me to talk about the Arabic culture to all of you, about stories that might seem foreign to most of us, about the importance of someone's ethnic roots within literature? My father posed these questions to me back in my senior year of high school. I was a teenager entering adulthood, and like most teenagers, I went through that phase of teen existentialism and angst. What do I do when I graduate? What college would I attend? If I were to attend college, what would I major in? If I happened to want to major in English, what were the prospects of that being truly beneficial to me in the long term? But at this point in my life, I began to take fictional writing seriously. Poetry especially was such a powerful platform for expression that it just became my day and night. I spent hours in my room reading, I spent hours writing, and in due time, my father began to take notice. And so he approached me with that question. Can you name an author who comes from Arabic descent? Now, it took me a long and deep moment of self-reflection and thinking to realize that I could not answer this question. And that irony isn't lost upon me, that the Egyptian American who wants to become a writer couldn't name a single Egyptian writer. But instead of dismissing this, my father took it as an opportunity to provide me with a solution. He introduced me to a man that, without any exaggeration, has become central for me pursuing writing today. For all those who couldn't name an author, an Arabic author, I would like to introduce you to this man. This man is Naguib Mahfouz. Naguib Mahfouz was a novelist, a short story writer, a philosopher, a scholar, any great label you could think of, you would be able to stick to his name. In the year of 1988, Mahfouz made history as the first person of Arabic descent to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And to this day, remains the only Arabic writer to receive this honor. When I started reading Mahfouz's work, I found myself personally connected to his writing in a manner that I have never felt in fiction before. He challenged and transformed my expectation of what a story can be. Mahfouz has a quote, and it goes, "Events at home at work, in the streets. These are the basis for a story. When I first came across this, I thought, of course, this is common knowledge. Everyone knows this. But when I began to reflect on its application to my work, whether the homes I had created in my writing had sheltered an Arabic family, whether the occupation of my characters had been fishermen on the Nile, or perhaps Egyptian architects creating complex geometric designs, whether the settings of my works had taken place in Cairene streets, souks, alleyways, coffee shops, mosques, and masajids, I began to realize that this quote wasn't as obvious as I made it out to be. After my introduction to Mahfouz, the types of literature that I was reading has gone through a metamorphosis. My understanding of literature has gone from being so linear to being reflective of the world's wealth of writing. I began to read more Arabic authors. I began to seek writings from around regions of the world that I was not familiar with, and it taught me the variety of what a story can be. How in Japan, Japanese poets have created the haiku to capture the essence and beauty of a certain moment in time. How in Persia, Sufi masters and mystics have created poems revolving around universal love to unify people together. How even in America, through the Black arts movement, emerged the choreo poem, a form that blends African dance, theater, and poetry to create a space for self-discovery and solidarity. By expanding the types of literature that I was reading, it inspired me to incorporate elements of my own heritage into my writing, something that once seemed like a revolutionary act. The reason we need cultural diversity within our literature can be summed up in one word: unity. Now, I know that word unite may sometimes seem like a Herculean task, but stories have the power to transcend them beyond the misconceptions we may have about one another, transforming it into empathy, to self-understanding, and to communal appreciation. Yet this raises a second question. How? How do we become more culturally inclusive and diverse within our collective arts, writings, and poetry? For that one-word question, there happens to be a one-word answer. The answer: you. Begin to ask yourselves, who are the types of writers and artists that you are accustomed with, and then start to branch out to forms of expression that you are unfamiliar with. If you're new to spoken word poetry, then invite your friends and enjoy a lively night of poetry slam. If you want to unearth writers from around regions of the world that may seem just beyond reach, then attend a local public reading and interact with authors who come from a diverse background. But most importantly, to diversify your literature, it all begins with reading a new author. Every single person who is in this room now, every single person who may be watching this, you all possess an inherent curiosity to storytelling. And by expanding your horizons, you'll begin to discover new arts, new writings, and new authors who will foster your understanding of what a story can be. Begin to search, explore, and engage with their stories, and then begin to tell your own. I'd like to close out with this piece titled, Dear Poetry. Dear Poetry, somewhere, someplace, a child from a small village first sees that you are ancient with the scent of bark from a gommier tree, that your evergreen hair full of thorns and fruits nest lost travelers as if they were black moths and sawflies. You have skin slick dark as the winged lips of a monarch butterfly and have become as unseen as God's sin, dear poetry. You are a tree that the child climbs, that when their fingernails scratch your trunk, they scratch your history. You're a womb of verses and splinters of age, the times you have given your poems to the village, when your odes have been passed around in classrooms, when your sonnets can bring song and laughter, dear poetry. You taught the child that with every breath, you can spill out a poem or two, that language is forever scribed in the blood, writing your story one heartbeat at a time, dear poetry. You have declaimed your fruit to the child who runs back to feed the villagers your promise, dear poetry. After eating your nectar, the villagers have traveled like seeds across the earth. They now plant your messages into the sun-baked ground. They now bloom like flowers. They whisper, say, magnolia. Say Khayyam's Rubai, say Malhuna, say Hellebore, say Bashu's Haiku, say Black Velvet, say Baby's Breath, say the blues can blossom, say Marigold, say Neruda's Odes, say Blood on the Field, say Blood in the Streets, say how street talk and hip hop, say Flower Child, say Flower Boy, say Guzzle, say Beloved Child. There is something I want you to hear. Please lend me your ear. Say rap, say the rose that grew from concrete, say changes, say lion's ear, say lily of the Nile. Say if God could sing, then they would sing through poetry. Say poetry, say poetry, say we all are poets. Say poetry, say poetry, say poetry. Dear poetry, you are the tree. You're the ripe fruit the child brought back to the village. You have become the villagers. You are the flowers that are blooming across this earth. You have become intimate with us, as close as a left eye, and we are your right. And though we sometimes may not realize you, we need each other. For can an eye without an eye be defined as an eye? Can people without poetry be defined? Thank you.